when we started this programme, I said that it was a momentous day for Britain because it was no less than defining what kind of country we wanted to live in. And the answer to that question, which is one that's haunted politics for a long time, whether we should be in or out of the EU, has been resoundingly answered.
We may have got a resounding answer in 2016, but 2.5 years later, are we much closer to knowing what Brexit does really mean, let alone the future shape, desires and dreams of the country we want to live in?
Just like this mad riddle that no one knows what it is, right?
I've listened very carefully to what has been said in this chamber and out of it.
This year, the debate has been defined by cabinet rifts, bad-tempered and often incomprehensible arguments.
I spent the last 3 years reading documents about no deal that you don't even know exist.
And the politics of pantomime. The plan, as things stand, is of course to leave the EU on March the 29th. But after another year of confusion and no clear route ahead, it's far from certain what that exit will even look like, let alone Britain's future shape. And one mantra definitely hasn't changed.
Brexit means Brexit.
There has been much sort of jocularity around the term Brexit means Brexit, but it does mean Brexit.
What does seem certain is that in 2019 we'll be navigating a world that is increasingly turbulent. This week served as a stark reminder of President Trump's America First message when his Secretary of Defense resigned, a day after Trump decided to pull troops out of Syria. As America looks inward, Russia is looking outward, with a more robust and aggressive role on the world stage.
Our friends had been suggesting for a long time that we visit this wonderful town.
Salisbury, a wonderful town?
Yes.
And this year saw the most extraordinary diplomatic row over the poisoning of the Skripals. But going into 2019, will a more confident and assertive China be a rising concern for security forces in the West? Just this week, President Xi Jinping warned other nations not to dictate to Beijing. And what does the future hold for our neighbours in Europe, who are facing their own problems, most recently with the dramatic Gilets jaunes protests in France? Back at home, the big questions remain unanswered. Will the UK become more global or more isolated? Will Britain's future look more like Singapore or Scandinavia? And will the United Kingdom's people and its constituent parts become more divided? Well, to chew over all this on this final Newsnight of 2018, we're joined by two journalists and two historians. Dr. Olivette Otele is a professor of colonial history at Bath University. Iain Dale is a presenter on LBC. Robert Colls is professor of cultural history at De Montfort University. And Anushka Asthana is presenter of The Guardian's Today in Focus podcast. Good evening to both of you. Asthana, if you think we were sitting here, Anushka, in 2019, do you think we'll be more divided or less divided a year from now?
Well, I really, really hope we'll be less divided. I think there is a real sense of not only division but pessimism at the end of 2018. The other day I was doing something on the ups and downs of this year, and I just put a sort of innocent tweet I thought out that said, what's your low point of 2018? And I was inundated with people saying things like, all of it, the dictatorship, January to December. I just couldn't get over it. And some of them were kind of really sad personal things, but way more of them were people on either side of this Brexit divide, furious about what was going on right now.
But does that angst then continue? I wonder how it will manifest itself, or whether or not nations will come to their own agreements about how they individually feel, or will we all be together in this?
I think it all depends on what happens over the next 3 months. I think the next 3 months are going to be very ugly in British politics, and that will seep through society. If we leave the EU on the 29th of March, and I think there's a big doubt about whether that will happen now, if we leave, the second referendum argument goes away, because it's kind of too late then. That's done, and I think that is one of the things that is fueling division, certainly in politics. It's kind of people see it as the Westminster media elites against people outside the M25 to an extent, but I think it goes much deeper than that.
Well, I wonder on that basis then that if, you know, in the months of next year, you know, the wrangle, as you see, we're coming in some very angry months, whether you can see 2019 in any way, no matter what happens, as a time when people restore their faith in politicians. And I do restore, because I do think that this year there's been an erosion of faith in politicians.
Oh, there absolutely has on both sides of the argument. If you are a Brexiteer, you can see it seeping away from you, and therefore you think, well, the politicians are disrespecting 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit. But equally on the other side, people who are the 48% that voted Remain think they're being ignored as well.
Well, let's talk about historians then. I mean, Robert, do you remember any other time in history where the country has been more divided? I suppose you could say you would say the English Civil War, perhaps. But when do you think we've been as divided?
Well, we had 3 civil wars at that time. Scotland.
We did indeed. We did indeed.
But I think the key point here is that there's never a time in our history when there haven't been divisions. There are always divisions. The real problem is that we're meant to have constitutions that somehow resolve our divisions and bring us together. And the problem we've got now is we've got a parliament that doesn't know how to express the national will. And that's a real problem for our constitution.
Wow, yeah.
As far as identity is concerned, I think it'll look after itself. I mean, you guys did a poll in June on English national identity, and 80% of the people you asked, of all regions, both genders, all classes, all ages, 80% said they felt strongly English. Strongly, note. So I think our real problem now is how do we find a constitutional way of resolving the differences you very rightly refer to.
Do you think history has any lessons in that and how we find the constitutional way?
I'm not sure. People have been talking about how this looks like 19th century, 18th century, 17th century. And I think that this is not even 21st century, 20th century Nazi Germany. But I don't really think that this is useful because you're drawing on the past unless you learn from the past. And we haven't. What we're doing is comparison. Yeah, and that's not interesting.
But I wonder what is it, you know, you talk about the fact, you know, that we don't have, you say there's an identity which is clear when it comes to opinion polls. That English identity doesn't suit, of course, the rest of the United Kingdom. Is there a vision that we can unite behind, do you think? Is there any idea of a vision for the future?
Well, I think we're going through a crisis, and an identity crisis as well, because I think that what it means to be British for some people is not exactly what it means to be British, for example, in Wales or in Scotland. And these fights are necessary. They're ugly, though, but they're necessary. And I strongly believe that we will come out of it at some point.
It's actually a strength, though, for it to be so vague, isn't it? In that if you asked all four of us to define what it means to be British, we'd all come up with a different answer, just as we don't have a written constitution. That actually can be quite an advantage in bringing people together in the long term, bizarrely, I think.
Well, let's move on now and talk about, you know, apart from the rest of Europe, EU, in the future, looking ahead, who are going to be our allies? Who are going to be our big allies? Especially we have this very difficult relationship at the moment with America. It is not, doesn't feel like a very special relationship at the moment.
Well, I think that we will have to, whatever happens through all of this, continue to be very closely allied to the rest of Europe. I mean, we're going to have to do that on a strategic basis. And I think that the relationship with America will also continue to be an important one, although some of those identity splits at the moment are to do with whether people are looking in one direction or the other. And I think a lot of the people, they may all want to be English, but a lot of people who voted Remain want to look in a different way to America at the moment.
So we've got America and we've got Europe, but who else? Who do we hitch ourselves to? And there's such turbulence in the moment.
We hitch ourselves to ourselves. I think it's been pretty good for about 300 years.
We hitch ourselves to ourselves, but not in an isolationist way.
No, no one, I mean, nobody I know suggesting that. The point about the constitutional question is it's not just about our relationship to London. It's about our relationship to the regions, to local government. You're going to talk about universal credit. The guy who's suffering from universal credit, Daniel Blake style, you're talking to tonight, needs to have someone to refer to. We need closer political connections, not more distant ones.
But where is our position in the world? You know, we can't hang on to the idea, the past idea of empire. You know, you talk about who our allies are. They're Europe, they're America, but you know, we are not the centrifugal force in the world anymore. You know, you have the rise and the difficulties in China and so forth.
It's a fundamental misunderstanding of Brexit and the motivations for Brexit to think that people who voted for Brexit wanted somehow to withdraw into themselves and become isolationists. It's exactly the opposite. Britain has always been an outward-looking nation. It's been a mercantile nation, a trading nation throughout the centuries. I mean, my two colleagues here can talk about this much better than I can. And that's going to continue. We have these huge number of countries now that can do proper trade with us, which in the empire, it was all sort of one-way traffic.
Where do you think, though, at this time next year, the power will lie in the world? Will we see big shifts?
Well, China will continue to rise, India, America, Russia. And I think that one of the things that we tend to forget is that we look at Brexit, we look at Europe, but we're not looking at Africa, where the battle is actually happening. This is where you see the real power struggle. And we've seen that in Africa, China is dominating at the moment, and Russian...
I mean, and the vision of the new Silk Road and so forth is phenomenal. That idea of the grand projet that we just simply can't do or don't do because we're not in that territory.
Yes, and European powers, and I'm thinking about French and Britain, they're losing out because, just to give you an example, recently the Americans and the Chinese are fighting in Kenya. Well, Prime Minister was in Kenya recently, and she wasn't able to actually convince them that the old ties are going to continue.
And we've dipped our toes into this in Africa. In Rwanda, for example, Britain has usurped France as the dominant influence there. But I mean, Rwanda is a very small country in Africa. We need to do a lot more.
But we talk in terms, in these aisles of punching above our weight as a small country. Do we even do that?
We're not a small
anymore?
country. We're the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yeah, but I think you're asking a hard question, actually. You know, I'm a historian. I don't do the future.
Oh, you sit and wait.
It's way above my pay grade. But as far as Russia's concerned, who knows about them? Yeah. Even the BBC can't handle Russia. China's, like the middle class, is always rising. It's the US who's basically our problem, and Trump is a problem, because our peace and security in Europe has not depended on the EU. It's depended on NATO. And his relationship to NATO sometimes I find scary. Because if he pulls out in NATO, you'll quickly find arguments over trade deals will melt compared to real issues like our peace.
Anushka.
Well, just picking up something you were saying before, Robert, the idea that we don't need to be connected to other countries around the world is just a slightly bizarre argument. Of course it's important, national identity is important, things that are going on these aisles are important. You said that earlier. You basically said that our allies, when asking about our allies, you were saying we need to be connected to ourselves. Yeah, but at the moment, in this kind of world at the moment, we need to look across the world for allies, and not just Europe and America, as I was saying, but to developing countries that are becoming much, much more important.